Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by outlining the main findings and conclusions of Open Europe's report, which you should be able to find on your seats, hopefully. Hopefully this will provide the context for the rest of the debate. The EU institutions, and by that I'm mainly talking about the European Commission, is by far the biggest channel for the UK's multilateral aid spending, receiving over half the UK's multilateral aid budget in 2009-10 and 18% of the UK's total aid spending. At a time when national budgets are being squeezed and national governments looking to ensure that they get the most value for money from every penny spent, I think we can all agree that the same rigour should be applied to aid spent at the EU level. In times of economic difficulty, it is also vital that we have full democratic accountability for how money is spent. When it comes to EU aid funded by the UK taxpayer, this means assessing how effective EU aid is measured against the UK's objectives and priorities. So let's turn to the question we're trying to answer this evening. What is EU aid for? The EU's aid budget, as it currently stands, is designed to do many different things at once. It's used for programmes aimed at developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. It's used in the EU's neighbourhood, including several middle-income countries in Eastern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. It is used for pre-accession funding to help supposedly future members of the EU, such as Turkey, make the grade. And finally, some of it is also passed on to other multilateral institutions such as the UN and the World Bank. Now that's quite a long list and a complex mix of objectives. Some of these tasks not only overlap with national aid programmes, but duplicate them. For example, the European Commission passes on roughly 1.4 billion euros, or 10% of its budget, to other multilateral donors every year. Surely national governments are perfectly capable of transferring these funds directly to these organisations without the Commission's help and the inevitable added administration costs. But more importantly, the sheer number of different objectives makes it extremely hard for governments and taxpayers to understand what it is exactly that EU-level aid is trying to achieve. For example, the 2005 Consensus on Development committed the EU to prioritise support to the least developed and other low-income countries. However, the percentage of Commission aid going to low-income countries in 2009 stood at 46%. This compares with 74% for UK bilateral aid. When we published our report, the Commission was extremely sensitive about this 46% figure. It argued that it was misleading to say that so little went to lower-income countries, since no lower-income country is eligible for the EU's neighbourhood funding or pre-accession funding. But this was precisely our point. Much of the Commission's aid budget is spent in neighbouring countries which are relatively wealthy in global terms. But crucially, this is still counted as development aid, or ODA. In 2009, for example, Turkey, an upper middle-income country, topped the list of recipients. Now, the relatively low percentage of EU aid directed to low-income countries is therefore an outcome of the mixed priorities of the Commission's aid budget. The real question is whether the Commission's aid budget is pursuing the right aims and how much money should be allocated to each. Now, there's clearly a legitimate discussion to be had about whether the Commission is simply funding the countries that Member States should be funding anyway. This is what officials in Brussels describe as a division of labour. And whether the Commission might be better suited to channeling aid to neighbouring or accession countries than the Member States. But the current all-encompassing approach makes it very difficult to have this discussion and focus on the details. In addition to the wide-ranging list of priorities, which confuse the boundaries between what is national and what is an EU-level competence, it also remains unclear whether much of EU aid spending meets the UK's objectives. In its 2011 multilateral aid review, the government looked at both streams of EU aid funding: the money spent via the EU budget, over which national governments have no choice but to contribute, and the European Development Fund, which currently sits outside the main budget and relies on voluntary contributions. In its review, DFID noted that while the European Development Fund has a strong poverty focus, more than 85% of the EU's other development aid programmes, funded by the main EU budget, is spent in middle-income countries. As a result, the EDF was rated strong on both its contribution to the UK's development objectives and its organisational strengths, but the rest of the Commission's aid budget was rated weak and satisfactory on the same measures. However, despite the differing performance of these two streams, the UK contributed £397 million to the better performing EDF in 2009-10, but a much higher £789 million to the poorly targeted and less effective Central Commission budget. Now, this distinction is important DFID officials have suggested the UK has been able to drive much better performance with the EDF precisely because it relies on voluntary rather than mandatory contributions. There is a potential threat that funding will be withdrawn if governments feel they are not getting value for money. But with the central mandatory EU budget, this threat is lacking, since there is always a pot of money that has to be spent. I would therefore argue that all contributions to the EU aid budget should be made voluntary, just as the EDF element already is. The UK should spend its aid budget directly through DFID unless there is clearly an EU value added. In this case, it could opt into specific EU programmes. And to be clear, this is not the same as saying that aid spending per se should become voluntary, but rather that once committed to spending the money, what is the most effective means of doing so? This could still leave a valuable role for the EU. The EU could provide a forum for coordination between donors, rather than acting as a 28th donor in its own right. Greater coordination could also increase aid effectiveness and reduce the administrative burden for recipient governments. So in conclusion, moving to an EU-level aid budget based on voluntary contributions would have the twin effect of both increasing accountability to national governments and taxpayers, providing a clear link between funding and objectives, and introducing the threat of funds being withdrawn if member states feel their objectives aren't being met. And secondly, it would focus minds in Brussels on where EU-level aid can really add value, and which would go a long way to help answering the question that we're trying to answer tonight. Thank you.